Welcome to Republican Roundtable. I'm your host, Max Reimer. Election season 2022 is heating up, and we have a ton of races to pay attention to. Specifically at the congressional level, we have a candidate in today from my favorite congressional district, CD3, Tom Weiler. Thank you for joining the Republican Roundtable. You are running for Congress in the 3rd Congressional District against Dean Phillips, potentially.
I am. Just one add to that. You can hopefully take off the potentially, because I intend to be running against Dean Phillips November 8th.
Very good.
And hopefully help plan his retirement party.
Why now? Why are you doing this?
My story actually started in the district. I grew up in Eden Prairie, graduated in 1996. Like all good Eden Prairie boys, played football for Coach Grant. Somehow did not win a state title, but after I left, I guess they started winning, and the rest is history. But my faith and my desire to continue to serve brought me off to Notre Dame following high school. I went to Notre Dame on a Navy ROTC scholarship, and upon graduation and commissioning, went off into the submarine community. Went to nuclear power school down in South Carolina, and then off to my first submarine, the USS Chicago, out in Hawaii. So if you're ever going to drive submarines, highly recommend you do it in Hawaii. But
Sounds good to me.
Serving was sort of my lifelong goal, and in the Navy, I love serving. Was on 4 submarines in total, and then 1 aircraft carrier. And actually, as I was getting ready to go back for my commanding officer tour on a submarine, I had a small twitch in my thumb, and went into Walter Reed down in Washington, D.C. Thought it was just going to be I was drinking a little too much coffee, but unfortunately was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's disease. So that eventually led to the end of my submarine career. Following the diagnosis, I continued to be in the active duty military for about 4 years, completed graduate degrees at National Defense University in Harvard, and also worked at the Pentagon and then volunteered for a deployment on the USS Eisenhower to the Middle East. But as I was deployed, my final medical waiver got denied, so I knew I could not get back into the submarine force, which sort of plateaued me in my military career, and I knew I wanted to continue to have leadership positions, and I knew I wanted to continue to serve the country I love. And as I started looking for options following retirement, I realized coming back home to serve in our Congress would be the opportunity to continue to serve my community and also move back home, and that's what I chose and threw my name in the hat, and we'll see how it goes.
There we go. Well, thank you for serving, Tom. Truly, I'm curious about that military experience. What do you think that prepared you? How do you think that prepared you for a role like this?
Well, I think it'll go. It'll transition very well. Actually, part of my military experience, I did have the opportunity to work as a Congressional Defense Fellow on Capitol Hill. So that was a pretty small program that Navy officers can apply to, and I was fortunately selected. So I worked for a year as a member of Congressman Rob Whitman's staff, and wore a coat and tie, worked at the Capitol for a year, and learned a lot from Congressman Whitman, who's still a congressman from Virginia. And I really understand now how both the good and the bad that occurs on Capitol Hill and in Congress, and really understand the legislative process to get good bills passed that improve not only the our district but countrywide. So I think that firsthand experience with policy development will be beneficial. But more importantly is just the leadership skills I learned throughout my submarine career. As a junior officer, you go to nuclear power school and you're back running a nuclear reactor off the coast of Canada, we'll call it, but the coast of whatever country we're operating off of. And you're running a nuclear reactor with a team of 9 to 10 young enlisted sailors, and you're running a nuclear reactor. And so to have that teamwork and develop those leadership skills, when you're a 22-year-old ensign out there, I think is really sets you up to develop further leadership as we go. And as you continue to progress in the submarine force, I went up through department head, and as driving the submarine on mission, and then my last tour on a submarine was the executive officer on the USS Michigan. So although I was ineffective at lobbying the Pentagon to shift the name to the USS Notre Dame, it was tough to serve on the Michigan, but honestly loved serving. And as an executive officer, it's you and the captain and the chief of the boat, the senior enlisted member, which is the triumphant sort of running the boat. So exceptional opportunity to lead 150 men and women conducting missions vital to national security. So I think that'll very effectively transition to me being an effective congressman and most importantly, an effective representative for the people of the 3rd District.
I do want to get into the 3rd District because, you know, for a long time it was a Republican district. I mean, you can really kind of date it back to the state's inception. Republicans held that seat for a long, long time. It seems like the suburban vote has kind of shifted a little bit. I know that the 3rd is changing quite a bit. What do you think why does Dean Phillips deserve to be fired?
For me, it's a really straightforward answer. May 29, 2020, at least for me, that's what changed my mind and motivated me to come back to run for this seat. I was deployed on the USS Eisenhower in the Middle East. We were operating in the Middle East, supplying air power to protect our way of life and defend freedom across the globe. I woke up early to prepare for duty as Battle Watch Captain, turned on the Armed Forces Network, and to my shock and sadness, I saw the streets of Minneapolis on fire and the 3rd Police Precinct in Minneapolis burned to the ground. I was out there on deployment, so I wasn't tracking the situation back home. But as I looked for information, and I couldn't believe this was happening back home, I looked for any leadership coming from our elected officials, and there was none to be found. Congressman Phillips was either inflaming the situation or doing absolutely nothing at all. And at that moment, I decided if that was the leadership or lack thereof back home, then if my medical waiver did not get approved in the submarine force, I would return to Minnesota and run for Congress and hopefully bring that Midwestern conservative principles, leadership, and a moral compass to D.C.
Talking about the district specifically, Tom, you know it well. You grew up here. It has changed quite a bit politically. The makeup of the voting block in the district, I guess you could say, it seems to be trending more and more blue. What makes you kind of the candidate, and what gives you the vision to run and win in this district?
I think it's trended away from us for the last 4 years, but to your earlier point, it was a strong Republican district for 30 years, and those conservative values are still there. And fundamentally, Congressman Dean Phillips is just on the wrong side of policy issues in this district. He's on the wrong side of crime and safety and security. He's on the wrong side of inflation, always voting for increasing government spending, which clearly impacts our inflation. And he's on the wrong side of education, making sure that our kids are learning how our small colony went from that to the shining light on the hill. So I think he's on the wrong side of policy issues, and I also think that his lack of leadership on those key issues in our district makes him very vulnerable to a strong Republican contender like myself. I think I have the personal story, the connection with the district, and also I've been successful with delegates and donors, as well as attracting outside interests from the NRCC and other groups to make sure that we have the resources to go up and defeat Congressman Dean Phillips this November.
As you're kind of campaigning, Tom, you listed out some of the issues: crime, school, education, inflation. What else are you kind of hearing? Even on those specific issues, what are you hearing specifically about those issues right now?
Fundamentally, it's as I traveled around the district, just came from a meet and greet tonight, other meet and greets, and a lot of the grassroots level meetings I've been to. First off, taking a step back, to me it's just really invigorating to see that effort and the hours that citizens across our district and across our country put into the grassroots movement and just their commitment to our district and to improve our government. What I see there is I talk to Republicans, Independents, and Democrats who just fundamentally feel that we're going in the wrong direction as a country. And to me, that's directly leads into my slogan: it's time to turn the ship around. And I think that applies to where we are with our safety and security in this district, where we are with 7% inflation, and our foreign policy right now based on weakness. Clearly, with the results in Afghanistan and the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine, we need to turn around the ship regarding our foreign policy, and that comes down to having a foreign policy based on strength and not weakness.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. Just the political climate that we live in right now. It seems like people have really lost faith in our institutions, in our Congress people, to not just to get things done, because I tend to think that when government gets too much done, it's too much bull crap, quite frankly. But when you're elected to Congress, you're a small fish in a big pond. You got to work with other people and that kind of thing. How do you see that role? How do you see, I guess, building bridges, not even across the aisle, but even with your own colleagues?
I think, again, that comes down to my experience as a military will set me up for success on that front. And my experiences growing up with a younger brother, older brother, and a younger sister in a big Midwestern family with cousins and uncles and aunts. You learn to work with others even though you don't agree with them 100% of the time on 100% of the issues, but working together to get results that benefit the lives of Americans. And to me, there's a pragmatic element of governing that is completely missing right now. Being ideologically so set in your ways that you won't bend a little bit to get what you can get done to improve America's way of life, that's just unacceptable to me at the federal government, local government, and state government. So I think bringing a sense of pragmatism and problem solving, which I was an engineer in undergrad, and driving submarines around the Pacific, you definitely have to solve problems, and those skill sets is what I intend to bring to Congress.
Dean Phillips, I think, has really hoodwinked the district, right? I think you probably would agree with that. It seems like he ran this campaign on everyone's welcome, all voices, this, that, and the other thing. Tom, if you could, just describe how partisan actually is this guy?
Well, he votes 100% with Nancy Pelosi this session, so that sort of says it all. It's not 90%, it's not 95%. He's 100% in alignment with a progressive politician who represents San Francisco. And last I checked, San Francisco and the 3rd District in Minnesota are fairly different. So yeah, he comes back, he says the word moderate every 4th word, and he really he's the Minnesota dean and the DC dean, and those are two different people, and they're two different ways of viewing our government. His problem solvers caucus, I sort of like to call it the problem admirers caucus. They admire problems in DC, and then they come back home and they talk about being on the problem solvers caucus, but I don't think they've solved any problems. At least it hasn't appeared to be in the last 1 year.
I think problems are growing.
Absolutely. So yeah, they've admired a lot of problems in DC, and I think Congressman Phillips has done that for 4 years. And I think our district and our state deserves better.
So up to this point, Tom, the campaign trail can be kind of a long and grueling thing. Obviously, you're doing meet and greets and you're making calls and that kind of thing. Just describe the process for people. I know we have a lot of viewers who don't exactly know what you're doing right now, who you're talking to, but give us kind of a step-by-step what you're doing right now and what you anticipate doing in a couple months here.
My first lessons in politics was it's a lot different than driving submarines. So, this is my first time doing this. And with that said, my goal is to be a representative because that's the title, to represent the people. It's not to be a politician dictating to the people. And I think there's a lot of politicians guilty of that today. And as far as the day-to-day right now, I'm into a foreign land right now. I haven't doing this before, but yeah, I'm reaching out to delegates and constituents throughout the district to understand what their concerns are. And their priorities become my priorities. And that's not because I'm selling myself out. That's because, again, I want to be a representative. I want to represent their needs and desires and their interests in D.C., not to go to D.C. like Congressman Phillips with a progressive agenda and just, go vote for vote with leadership. So yeah, along with reaching out to delegates and constituents, we're working the BPOU conventions coming up, and then our CD3 convention the 23rd of April. So that's sort of the next hurdles. And with all that sort of day-to-day grind, getting name recognition, getting some donor dollars and delegates, we're also keeping our eye on the big game plan here, which is November 8th, beating Dean Phillips. I definitely didn't jump into this race to win a convention or to win a primary. I jumped in the race to represent Minnesotans across the 3rd District in D.C., and to do that, we need to beat Dean Phillips on November 8th.
It's interesting that you make mention of beating Dean Phillips, because I think that sometimes we lose Republicans, we lose the eye on the prize, I guess you could say, and I'm curious, just to win in this district, even in what I think will be a great year for Republicans, you got to probably do things differently. I'm curious, Tom, what do you how is your campaign doing things differently?
Last I Googled, Congressman Phillips, I think had a net worth of around $80 million. It might be plus or minus a couple million here and there. So I told our fundraiser we intend to raise $81 million, so we'll have more resources going into November. But no, I think to your point on doing things differently, one is we're going in eyes open that Congressman Phillips, as the race gets closer and closer this fall, will outspend us. And I think we have the right messaging and we're on the right side of policy issues that he's going to be able to outspend us, and we're going to be able to get more votes than him. Other things are, talking about my experiences and my story is unique to the district, and I think my story and reason for running is resonating with people across the district. And the other thing, to your point, is in the past, Congressman Phillips hasn't been running on the coattails, or the coattails going in the wrong direction of the Biden administration. Now people have seen, right in front of them for the last 12 to 13 months, what a progressive Biden agenda with the support of people like Congressman Phillips looks like. And what it looks like is, historic high crime, record inflation, and schooling not up to par. So I think, unfortunately for everyone in the 3rd District and Americans, if you just keep reading the headlines, that's more and more reason for Republicans, Independents, and Democrats to get out and vote and turn the ship around.
It's funny that you make mention about, Biden's weakness. I think a lot of people back in 2010, we talked about the Tea Party movement, and there was just this groundswell, and it seemed like the only thing that was buffering that groundswell was you still had this broadly popular president. How much of this is about tying Dean Phillips to Joe Biden?
Yeah, I think there's a big piece of that. One, because Congressman Phillips votes 100% with the Biden agenda, so I don't think it's a stretch, one, to time to that. but two, I think it comes back to one of Ronald Reagan's sayings: "Are you better off today than you were 1 year ago?" And thankfully, COVID is definitely in a much better spot than it was a year ago. But as far as inflation goes and crime goes, and just the optimism for our youth today, the optimism for kids in high school right now to live out their American dream, I think is not what it was 2 years ago or 4 years ago or 10 years ago. And that, unfortunately, is a reflection of bad policies by the Biden administration.
Yeah, I think the issues are slapping us all in the face. It's, everyone knows about education/indoctrination in our schools. I know that that's been a big issue in CD3. There's been, some stories about Edina and that kind of thing. As a congressman, Tom, what can you do about education?
Yeah, well, I think both two issues that are front and center, both education and crime, are definitely not issues that D.C. needs to come and try to micromanage and solve those problems in the 3rd District. And as a Republican congressman, I had fundamentally reduction in government, reduction in the federal government is what I want to see. And with that said, we need to let local politicians, state politicians, and state leaders and local leaders solve those issues. So we definitely don't need micromanagement from DC on those issues, but we also need to make sure we're not adding administrative requirements without adding funding. So things like definitely on the crime front, safety and security, we need to make sure if there's new requirements added to the police forcing or police forces, we need to make sure we add additional resources as well. And as far as education goes, I think we just need to get out of the indoctrination business and educate, our kids and return to where it was. I mean, our education system has never been perfect, just like our country's never been perfect. And I was never taught our country was perfect.
Right.
But for some reason now we have this huge pendulum shift focused on every evil or every bad thing that America's ever done, and we neglect to teach all the great things America has done, and including, being the bedrock of democracy and leading our world for the last 80 years of peace, thankfully.
Right.
So, I think a fundamental shift in our education system is critical to the future of our country.
And I think so often people do forget about the bully pulpit you have as a congressman.
Absolutely.
Just because you're not the one writing legislation at the state level, well, it's like, geez, Tom believes that, so I can believe that strongly too as a state legislator, as a governor, what have you.
Absolutely. Just one point on that, I was talking to a police chief in the district, and almost in frustration, I was saying, what can I hopefully do as a congressman to help support and alleviate the crime situation that we're having in our district right now, and sort of, thinking I couldn't solve problems from D.C., I just said, to my understanding, the best thing we could do is just, supply that support and use that bully pulpit to support law enforcement. And he sort of cut me off right there. He said, absolutely, that's what we need.
Yeah.
Because he just says politicians don't realize how undercutting and how policemen feel like they just get hung out to dry, basically,
Yep.
when they don't have that support from elected leaders. And the second a cop makes a mistake or makes an error, then all of a sudden all policemen are bad, and you're back to square one on that.
Right.
So yeah, using that bully pulpit in a positive manner, and having that support for both law enforcement and for teachers and school districts and fundamentally parents to be involved with their kids' education.
Yes.
Parents aren't the enemy in their kids' education. They're clearly, we want parents involved in their kids' education. It leads to better education for our kids,
Right.
which leads to a better future for our country.
That's like when I saw the National Teachers Union group, and then also Merrick Garland talking about, hey, we're going to investigate parents as terrorists. It's like, what are we doing here?
Yeah. That can sort of open a can there of as far as why are we investing resources and time
That's right.
for FBI to look into those types of things, for parents to go to school board meetings and be upset with their kids' education. I mean, it doesn't matter where on the political spectrum you are. That should be a good thing. You want parents involved in their kids' education. And the fact that we've taken these drastic measures that don't make any sense, and we're wasting resources on that when we have other much more serious crime issues going on is sad to see.
Now, as a future congressman, you hold the purse, and one of those things that I'm very concerned about, you mentioned it before, was inflation, but also inflation stemming from, we got a spending problem. Our national debt is $30 trillion. Tom, what do you do as one congressman to take on a behemoth? It's bigger than a behemoth, like that.
It really is. I mean, just the stat I've been tossing around lately is I think we've spent $13 trillion of the federal government in the last 2 years, and our tax revenue is about $8 trillion. So I'm an engineer, not an accountant, but I know that's not setting our country up for success right now.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not setting my kids up, my 4- and 6-year-old up for success down the road. So yeah, we absolutely have a spending problem. And that is this excessive growth of the federal government, acting like the federal government is the only way to solve anyone's problems in this country. I fully agree with a safety net for people who are at times of need and people who slip through the cracks and need federal assistance. But it shouldn't be, it's a safety net, it's not a hammock.
Right.
It's not meant to be a luxurious lifestyle and just sort of a never-ending support. We need systems in place to help those in need and then get them back on their feet. And that's both good for them and our country.
Yeah.
I think clearly we have a spending problem. And I think a couple ways, one way that I'd like to look into addressing that is just go to a 2-year budget cycle. Our Congress hasn't passed a budget in the normal timing and the normal process since I think the early 90s or mid 90s. I mean, so that's just Congress not doing their job. And yet they sort of play hero ball, a term from sports, that they go in, 2 days before the government's going to shut down, and miraculously we have this deal, and senators and
1,000 pages. Worth
1,000 pages.
spending.
No one reads it. Oh, take what they got last year, add 2%, and we'll call it good.
Yeah.
That's not budgeting. No. So I think moving to a 2-year budget cycle, congressmen get elected, they approve one budget, and guess what? 2 years later, they can be held accountable to that budget by the voters to see if that was a good budget or not, and it would reduce the workload in half as far as those budgets that we try to do annually now, and we haven't done successfully completed since the 90s.
Right. You talked about foreign policy and even just some of the expertise, I think, Tom, that you can bring to the position in that realm. As you kind of see, you talked about peace through strength. As you kind of see this situation unfolding in Ukraine as a veteran, what goes through your mind about not only leadership at the congressional level, but just the state of our country and the people leading it right now?
First off, it's tragic. I mean, the people in Ukraine are in my thoughts and prayers, because they're just in a horrible situation, and President Putin is responsible for this. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. He's the dictator that's deciding to commit war crimes and inflict unbelievable suffering and pain to the Ukrainian people. With that said, we definitely. I think we had a lot of options before this conflict got to where it is today, to sort of preemptively, sort of proactive deterrence is what I called it. I know a thing or two about nuclear deterrence from my time in the submarine force, and nuclear or kinetic deterrence is clearly a threat that you don't use in peacetime. But as the Russian troops were building up on the Ukrainian border, and our intelligence clearly indicated that Russia had plans to invade Ukraine, we had opportunities to provide proactive deterrent measures through sanctions, economic sanctions, political sanctions, and that we needed to be aggressive at that point, and with supplying Ukraine with foreign assistance and lethal weapons before the situation ever started. And I think the Biden administration would have been negotiating from a position of strength there to say, President Putin, the sanctions are on. So if you pull your troops back from the Ukrainian border, then we'll look at relaxing the sanctions. Instead, we let Putin dictate, and the sanctions as a deterrent, they clearly were ineffective because it did not deter the aggression.
No, he seems pretty bold.
And yeah, deterrence isn't a retroactive thing. You deterred to stop a bad act before it occurs, and clearly the bad act is in progress.
And it's just fascinating. And I'm no expert, but to watch the difference between how the world responded to Donald Trump, for instance, versus how they respond now with Joe Biden, it does seem kind of night and day, at least in that respect, right?
And again, I think there's a fundamental difference between if you go into the negotiating table from a position of strength or weakness. And unfortunately, I think the Biden administration, both from Afghanistan to the Ukraine, hopefully not to a bad deal with Iran, but when you're negotiating from a position of weakness, you don't get good results.
Right.
And clearly, when you're negotiating against the likes of President Putin or the leaders of Iran or China, they have a different view on what the world order should look like to them. So we need to be the strong leader of the world.
Tom, we talked about some big issues. Talked about crime, inflation, education, foreign policy. As you talk to delegates and activists and really do the campaigning thing, are you hearing any issues that don't get the headlines right now? Or is there anything else that we should be paying attention to maybe that we're not right now?
I think those sort of are the big four for sure. Yeah, it's unfortunate. They are the big four because they're so obvious that there's issues. I mean, crime is at a historic high right now, sort of across the country, but definitely in the Minneapolis area and the 3rd District. Inflation, is at record highs. It's not inflation's 3%, 4%. No. It's at record highs. And our education is sort of the same thing. So yeah, I think those are the big 3 local issues. The tragedy in Ukraine has definitely highlighted some of our foreign policy errors. And then to me, the other big one is securing the southern border. I mean, that's just it's a sort of amazing to me that that's a partisan issue all of a sudden. I mean, if you look back at President Obama's speeches regarding that, or President Clinton, they sound just like Republicans sound today. We need a secure border.
Yeah.
We can't allow illegal immigrants to just come into our country, and we can't incentivize them to come into our country illegally. So the fact that the sort of goal line of the Democratic Party, or the goalpost for the Democratic Party on that specific issue has shifted where it is, which is an unsecure border, which just opens the door to both illegal immigrants coming in as well as bad actors. So that to me is the other issue that I do hear a fair amount about in the district.
Tom, with the last minute of the program today, how can people learn more about you? How can they get involved, and what do you need help with?
Yeah, it's weilerforcongress.com is our website, and as much support we can get on there. Sign up to join the team. You'll get on our email list. We're doing meet and greets across the district. We're ramping up for the convention season, so the 23rd of April. And then we have availability online to donate. Obviously, we need to maximize our resources to win the convention, win the primary, and then most importantly, help Congressman Dean Phillips retire November 8th so we can get Midwestern conservative leadership principles back into D.C. with a moral compass to help improve our way of life in the district and improve my 4- and 6-year-old and all American kids' opportunity at an American dream.
I got a 5- and 3-year-old, so I know how it goes, Tom, and thank you. Thank you for serving, thank you for running, and thank you for joining the program today. Tom Weiler, Congressional District 3 candidate, thanks for joining the Republican Roundtable.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with your viewers.
Absolutely. This has been the Republican Roundtable. I'm your host, Max Reimer. Until next time.